Hey everyone, and welcome to the 5 Bytes podcast. And now a roundup of this week's enterprise IT news highlights. First in the news this week, Forbes provided a timely reminder that Microsoft has been renewing expiring Secure Boot certificates for the first time. Now, this is something I covered on the podcast, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago at this point, because there was a warning about it. Forbes warns that unless your PC is under 2 years old, you're still reliant on these secure boot certificates. They're based on certificates that were issued in 2011, and they expire in June of this year, by which time you need to have installed the 2023 secure boot certificates to stay safe. Microsoft says that starting in April 2026, the Windows Security app displays additional information about the status of Secure Boot certificate updates on your device, and you can find this under Device Security Secure Boot. This obviously requires the latest April Windows updates, which means if you have Windows 10, you must enroll in ESUs, which are extended security updates, to get the update. So this may be the first time where the rubber meets the road in terms of Windows 10 end of support and in not getting patches anymore, where there is going to be quite an important patch that organizations should get. So if you are continuing to use Windows 10, buyer beware. And speaking of Windows updates, right on cue, there was some news about potential issues caused by last week's April Windows updates or Patch Tuesday updates. So Microsoft is reportedly investigating an issue causing this month's KB 508-2063 security update to fail to install on Windows Server 2025 systems. On affected systems, users are also reporting seeing 0x800F0983 install errors when trying to deploy the April 2026 cumulative updates. It's believed to affect a limited number of servers at this time. Microsoft also warned that some Windows Server 2025 devices will boot into Bitlocker recovery after deploying KB 508-2063, which is the security update, and that'll obviously prompt users to enter their Bitlocker recovery key, which is always a bit of a pain in the butt. And while BleepingComputer.com had warned about BitLocker recovery prompts on Windows Server, I saw that Microsoft also published an advisory for Windows 11 version 25H2 and 24H2 suggesting the same. But for those operating systems, there is a known issue rollback already available and a potential workaround involving a group policy as well. So if you potentially want to avoid having to mess around, I was going to use a curse word, mess around with your BitLocker settings before you're deploying and after you're deploying your Windows updates for April, check out the advisory that Microsoft has published, and I'll share a link to that with this episode, which is episode 436, and you can find it at 5bytespodcast.com or in the YouTube description for this episode. In an update to a story I covered just last week about Citrix customers potentially running into functionality problems if they don't switch to the new licensing mechanism, well, there's an extra wrinkle now that has appeared. In an advisory, Citrix shared that they identified an issue that will affect NetScaler SDX appliances that have migrated from the file-based licensing to LAS. If this issue is not addressed, the SDX appliances and all VPX instances hosted on it would be unexpectedly unlicensed. The advisory outlines the impacted scenarios and the actions required to prevent unlicensing. The LAS-compatible NetScaler SDX versions impacted include 14.1-66.x, -60.x, -56.x, -51.x, as well as 13.1-62.x, -61.x, and -60.x. I hate when there's a list of versions to read out. So if you have any of those versions, and if you have migrated your SDX appliances from the file-based licensing to LAS-based licensing and have certain legacy file-based license files that are still present on the SVMs after the transition to LAS, you need to read this advisory and take the required actions. And for those customers who have already migrated to LAS, those actions include Citrix recommending you to back up all of the files before you perform any deletion, and then follow a deletion process where you have to delete some legacy file-based licenses from the SVM shell That would be located at /npsconfig/license, and you're essentially deleting all of the .lic files except for one, the citrix-startup.lic file. So important to keep that, I guess. And for customers who have not actually completed the migration yet to LAS, you need to complete that migration as I covered on last week's episode. And then the rest of the steps are the same. You want to delete any remnant LIC files except for that citrix-startup.license file. And the way that I read this advisory, it seems like this was not a known issue until recently. So customers might be in a little bit of a bind. They might think that they've completed the process and they're safe, but this one might come to bite them. The US CISA has warned US government agencies to secure their systems against a Windows Task Host privilege escalation vulnerability that could allow attackers to gain system privileges. Tracked as CVE-2025-60710, this Windows security flaw stems from a link following weakness affecting Windows 11 and Windows Server 2025 devices, and it was patched back in November of last year. The vulnerability can be exploited by local attackers with basic user permissions via low-complexity attacks, enabling them to gain system privileges and then take full control of compromised devices. The CISA didn't share any details regarding these attacks, and Microsoft has yet to update their security advisory to confirm active exploitation. And something I did not cover last week, but also comes from the US CISA, they recently gave federal agencies 4 days to secure their networks against a critical severity vulnerability in Avanti Endpoint Manager Mobile that has been exploited in attacks since January. So while the US CISA typically warns US government agencies, which is kind of under its remit, it's also good advice to just adhere to what they're suggesting, because as go they, so goes the world, I guess. WindowsCentral.com has reported that Microsoft is preparing new updates for its Surface Pro and Surface Laptop lines of PCs that will feature new chips, upgraded displays, and other quality of life improvements. Microsoft is reportedly planning to ship both Intel and Snapdragon models in a 2-stage rollout that will see the Intel models rolling out first. Now, a lot of the article that I'm referring to seems to be kind of rumor and innuendo and maybe opinion, although it might be like from a valid source, but I would maybe take it with a pinch of salt because it says, according to sources familiar with the plans, Microsoft will launch the new Surface PCs that will be powered initially by Intel Core Ultra 3 chips this spring, followed by the Snapdragon X2 variants in the summer. And the devices will start with 16 gigs of RAM and 256 gigs of storage, with options going all the way up to 64 gigs of RAM and 2 terabytes of storage. And it seems one of the sources here is there's early retail listings for the products, which does seem like a pretty good source at least. Now those have since been pulled, so maybe it was a little bit too early. And there's more speculation around the display types for the different devices as well, and more technical details. And I'll share a link to this article if you want to read it for yourself. The massively popular Booking.com have warned that unauthorized third parties may have been able to access certain booking information associated with customers' reservations. Booking.com said it noticed suspicious activity affecting a number of reservations, and it immediately took action to contain the issue. And they said, quote, based on the findings of our investigation to date, accessed information could include booking details and names, emails, addresses, phone numbers associated with the booking, and anything that you may have shared with the accommodation, end quote. They go on to explain how updated PIN numbers have been issued to keep bookings secure. And they suggest if you have received suspicious emails or phone calls, these could be from malicious actors pretending to represent the accommodation or Booking.com. And they say that they'll never ask you to share credit card details by email, over the phone, through text, or WhatsApp. And they'll never ask you to make a bank transfer that is different from the payment policy details in your booking confirmation. And they're urging customers to remain vigilant. Anthropic has launched Opus version 4.7, which it claims is much more useful than Opus 4.6, which is pretty amazing given that the prior version came out just over 2 months ago. And xda-developers.com has a pretty interesting chart showing the various different large language model releases from Anthropic, showing just how close in release dates they are to each other. So it just seems like the progress is pretty startling and rapid. Opus 4.7 is reportedly notable due to improvements over Opus 4.6 in advanced software engineering, with particular gains on the most difficult tasks. Users report being able to hand off their hardest coding work, the kind that previously needed close supervision, to Opus 4.7 with confidence. Opus 4.7 handles complex, long running tasks with rigor and consistency and pays precise attention to instructions and devises ways to verify its own outputs before reporting back. Now, this is not the much anticipated and much feared Mythos that I alluded to on last week's episode of the podcast. Cloud Mythos is now in preview, however, and it has rolled out to a select few companies as part of a new cybersecurity initiative called Project Glasswing earlier this month, which, as I reported last week, is what led to heads of the regulators in the United States and various different executives from some of the large companies in the US meeting out of concerns for, I guess, just how startling it is at being able to generate exploits and find vulnerabilities. So our days could be numbered, I guess. TechRadar.com has reported that Microsoft is thought to be working on its own autonomous AI agents inspired by OpenClaw. TechRadar suggests that these would target local or cloud-based agents or a hybrid of the two. But if today's Copilot is anything to go off, they would likely either only work within Microsoft's ecosystem or at best, at least just work best with the Microsoft ecosystem. If Microsoft were to come out with its own OpenClaw-like agentic platform, it would likely target enterprise customers at first, building on existing Copilot co-work development. And I don't think this is all that surprising because at Microsoft Ignite last November, they were talking about their Kua project, which I think is still in preview. It's certainly not available yet, but I believe it is in preview, which would essentially be leveraging Windows 365 cloud PCs for running some agentic workloads. They also already have some of the building blocks. No, they, of course, don't really have their own robust mainstream large language model, and they have been depending on others, like primarily OpenAI for GPT versions. But they do have Power Apps, which could potentially do some of the middle work in terms of being able to teach AI how to carry out a process and then have the AI follow that workflow and the process, possibly. Also related, Microsoft has launched a new E7 subscription tier, which bundles parts of Microsoft 365, Copilot, and Agent 365 for a new world in which bosses are expected to manage humans and AI agents simultaneously. Microsoft also recently declared Copilot users had grown 160% year over year, and the daily active users were up 10x. So it's also kind of interesting if you take it in the context of the story that I covered last week, where there was a Microsoft executive talking about potentially charging a product license per agent. So if you have 20 employees today and you get rid of 10 of them and replace them with 20 AI agents, you'll be consuming 30 licenses versus the 20 you used to have, which I shared my thoughts on that. If you didn't listen to last week's episode, you could check that out to hear that story for yourself. And by the way, I don't know if I really promote it much, but typically on the YouTube version of this podcast, it's broken into chapters, and I believe it is on some other platforms as well that do chapters. So you can go back to last week's episode and just find that chapter. In details shared with newwin.net, Microsoft has reportedly described a sophisticated campaign that was being carried out by North Korean state actor Sapphire Sleet to hack macOS customers. Interestingly, the attack involved social engineering more than exploiting software flaws, which honestly is probably not all that interesting or surprising because an awful lot of attacks seem to lean more heavily on the social engineering aspect to gain access. But essentially, The threat actor had set up recruiter profiles, which would engage with targets regarding job opportunities and then send them invites for technical interviews. When the candidates join the meeting, they are asked to install a Zoom SDK update.scpt file provided during the meeting. This Apple script file opens in the macOS script editor by default, and while it appears completely harmless and official on first glance, if you scroll thousands of lines, you'll come across harmful code embedded inside it. The unsuspecting target is asked to execute the script, which triggers the malware attack. Upon execution, the script downloads additional malware payloads using trusted mechanisms while also keeping track of the campaign progress using distinct user agent strings. The malware then begins its reconnaissance activity through which it collects details about your account and machine. It then launches a malicious system update app which asks the user to enter their password so they can configure their settings. The dialog box uses native macOS elements, so it is visually indistinguishable from a legitimate prompt, according to Microsoft. And then once the password is validated against your system's database, it is immediately exfiltrated to Sapphire Sleet using the Telegram bot API. Then the attack toolchain triggers a software update application, which gives the illusion of the Zoom update process that completes successfully, and that could reduce any doubt that you may have had about the legitimacy of the software. And finally, it installs multiple backdoors to ensure persistence on the target's machine. The data exfiltrated includes, reportedly, host and system reconnaissance, installed applications and runtime verification, messaging session data, browser data and extension storage, macOS keychain, cryptocurrency desktop wallets, SSH keys and shell history, Apple Notes, system logs, and failed access attempts. So I think obviously SSH keys, Apple Notes, shell history, cryptocurrency desktop wallets, browser data, macOS keychain extension or macOS keychain, some pretty sensitive data being taken there. Following the discovery, Microsoft reportedly informed Apple about the malware campaign, after which the latter strengthened its security infrastructure on macOS and Safari in particular. So I just found this one of interest because this is Microsoft reporting to Apple about something that is affecting Apple users and customers, which is a good thing. I mean, it's good that there's this type of collaboration. But now this episode's scripts, tricks, and tips. This one's a mix of news and a tip, really, and a little bit of self promotion, quite frankly. So I apologize. But on April 14th, I did a webinar together with Microsoft about the AppV full infrastructure end of life. And during it, I unknowingly did the first live demonstration of managing applications with App Attach and Azure Virtual Desktop with the newly generally available supported Windows Server 2025 on AVD. And I saw that the New Messing team clipped that from our webinar and started sharing it on social media. So I'll share a link to a clip if you'd like to see Windows 2025 running on AVD and also having these cloud paging application containers delivered via App Attach. It's kind of cool, and it did make me think a little bit about, why would someone want to run Windows Server 2025 on AVD? Well, I'd imagine it's if you want to have a greater user density on some of those devices and workloads, probably particularly for remote app as well. While the multi-session Windows 10 and Windows 11 certainly does have its place, just the way it is architected, you're going to get far less user density compared to the server counterpart. So there is definitely a need and a want for this. But that's it for this week's episode. Like I said on last week's episode, this is an early week release, and next week is going to probably be early as well. And I'm not sure about the week after that. So we'll see how things shake out. And thank you for listening.